group has done, that's for sure, then you are de facto responsible in the present for that.
How do you think we got to this point where people are repeating these patterns that were ultimately incredibly unsuccessful and dangerous and deadly in the past, like Marxism, for example? Like, people proudly proclaim themselves as having Marxist ideology.
One in five social scientists claims to be a Marxist.
How do they not understand the history? Well, why don't you fill people in on how that went bad?
Well, the estimates vary, but in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959, somewhere between 30 and 50 million people were killed in internal oppression alone. So that's pretty bad. And then in China, which was operating under exactly the same principles, it might have been up to 100 million killed during Mao's time. And of course, Mao is still revered in China, appallingly enough. And Vietnam and Cambodia, and wherever these ideas were implemented, Cuba, wherever these ideas were implemented, the result was absolute mayhem. And I think what happened is that the Marxist ideas are actually quite attractive if you're an intellectual, and if you're, I would say, if you're tilted towards compassion from a personality perspective, because they're based on doctrines like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And the idea that you should fulfill people's needs, or that society should fulfill people's needs, is on the surface of it an attractive idea. Of course, the problem is who gets to define the needs and who gets to define the abilities, and that really is a big problem. And well, and then those ideas were put into practice first in the Soviet Union, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, did a very lovely job of detailing in horrifying detail how those initial doctrines were transformed into legislation, and then how those legislation was transformed into endless genocide, essentially, and almost destroyed the world. Let's not forget that. Partly with the help of Castro, who just died. The doctrines, when put into into actual practice, were murderous instantaneously. Now, what happened? There were always apologists for the left in the West, especially in France, especially among the French intellectuals, especially in the late 1960s. And then when all of the information about what was happening in the Soviet Union came flooding forward, and that culminated, say, about 1973, when Solzhenitsyn's book was published, the French intellectuals changed their tune. Instead of agitating on the part of the working class, which allied them with murderous Marxists, they switched and started to talk about power and to talk about group identity. It was like a sleight of hand. The underlying pathological philosophy remained exactly the same, but the surface nomenclature changed, and that became very attractive. And at the same time, the Soviet Union dissolved. And so one of the problems I think we have now, a perverse problem, is that these Marxist ideas are very attractive to compassionate intellectuals, and we don't have good, bad examples like the Soviet Union around that everybody can point to and go, yeah, well, that sounds good, but, what about the murderous death camps and the millions of people who are suffering? We still have North Korea, but, people treat North Korea like it's a joke instead of like it's an exemplar of a pathological system. And people have no historical memory. Like my students, and that's partly because they're taught so badly in schools, is they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. They have absolutely no idea. They know a little bit about the Second World War, maybe. And of course, people generally know about the Holocaust, but they have no idea what happened in the Soviet Union. So they have no idea where these ideas could lead. And the universities and the high schools are so full of people who are radically left-leaning that the students are never taught any proper history. They're taught about the evils of capitalism. And it's not like any system is perfect, but there's difference between imperfect and consciously murderous.
I think one of the things that you just said that's very important is that it's attractive to compassionate intellectuals, people that, without really looking at what the potential for these laws and regulations, what the negative potential for them is, the underlying inclination to lean towards that is that you care about people, and that you want people to be okay, and
you're kind of treating them like they're your children.
Yes.
And I don't mean that in an entirely sarcastic manner. it's reasonable in some sense to treat other people like people that you love, although it's not reasonable in very many other ways, which is why you don't invite every stranger on the street to come and live with you in your house. I mean, everybody puts up boundaries, and you have to do that. But and people tend more than we ever expected, and I've done a lot of research in this in my lab, that people do tend to vote and think their temperament a lot more than anyone really realizes. And if you're kind, and that's your highest virtue, then you tend to treat people like they're kin, because that's what kind means, right? It's an extension of the word kin. But that doesn't work well in larger groups. You need other principles. And so you look at something like the idea of equity, which is equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. On the surface of it, it seems perfectly reasonable to say, well, if every resource isn't distributed absolutely equally to every group, then the system is unfair. And on the face of it, that's a reasonable proposition, but it falls apart under minimal examination. So here's something to think about for everyone who thinks that equality of an outcome is a good idea. It's like, why the hell are you striving for anything then? Because the reason anyone strives to better themselves or to develop a skill or to move forward in life at all is to produce inequality. You're trying to rise above the mediocre masses every time you make an effort at anything. And so everything that we associate positive movement forward to, or positive motivation, is actually an attempt to render the world more unequal. Now, you're rendering it unequal in a just way, right? Because we might say, well, if you work really hard, you deserve an unequal outcome. Well, yeah, unless you want people to stop working hard. And that was the old joke in the Soviet Union, you know. They pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. So it's so thoughtless. That's the problem.
That is a big problem with the phrase income inequality. You never hear effort inequality, because effort is not the same.
Oh, well, you know, on some campuses, and this is true in California, it's now considered a form of aggression. It's classified under the microaggression to say that hard work is one of the reasons that people accumulate more value, accumulate more property, accumulate more money. It's an aggression. It's aggressive to say that, because it implies that people who are poor don't work hard. Now, see, that's another terribly fuzzy form of thinking, because there are lots of reasons for people to not have money, many, to be poor, let's say, which is even different than not having money. Alcoholism, drug addiction, mental illness, physical illness, intellectual incapacity, and lack of work. All of those things contribute.
Also environmental factors, communities you grow up into, what you're being exposed to. People imitate their atmosphere. You're around people that are constantly in trouble with the law, and you're dealing with horrible environments. There's a lot of factors. Yeah. And I think that one of the things that's really important about having these discussions is that they break down these rigid ideologies that a lot of these kids that are going to these universities are sort of being shoved into. They're being shoved into these ideologies. You're either on the left or you're on the right, and there's very few on the right. There's no open market of ideas when it comes to discussing these things. You're compelled and enforced into certain categories.
Jonathan Haidt he's a psychologist at the New York University Business School. He's done a really good job of documenting the dearth of ideological viewpoints, let's say political or temperamental viewpoints, because that's more accurate, in the modern university. And it's appalling, because along with all this push for ethnic and sexual and racial diversity, which I think is just a mask to enforce a kind of ideological homogeneity, there's no even understanding that ideational diversity is the only relevant value for a university. The rest of it's all predicated, say, on the assumption that if you do select people because of their ethnicity or racial background or gender, that will in and of itself produce diversity of ideas, which is another really pernicious idea, because it assumes that, and it's so contradictory. The left describes anything that's associated with the assumption that someone who's female, for example, will think in a female way. They regard that as an unreasonable prejudice. Yet they're perfectly reasonable to say that we need more women in X discipline because they will bring in female ideas. It's like, well, what what the hell are female ideas? You can't have it both ways unless you're completely, unless you don't care at all about coherence or consistency, and ideologues really don't, because they care about putting their ideology forth. But the idea that you're going to get a diversity of ideas because you have a diversity of class of people assumes that ideas and identity are the same thing, and that's an absurd proposition. In fact, that's an essentially racist proposition. Black people think differently than white people. No, some do and some don't, and the overlap is substantive, and the difference between the individuals is far greater than the difference between the groups.
I think we also need to make a very clear distinction between discrimination